Thank you, Ray. Well, I'm doing really well. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Exactly. Actually, we're in the most historic part of the winery that dates back to 1885. Now, Beaulieu was actually founded in 1900. The building was originally built by a California senator named Seneca Ewer, and de la Tour didn't actually purchase the building until 1923, which of course was well into Prohibition. And the reason that he purchased this spot, well, there were really two reasons. One, he ran out of space at his original winery because of his success making sacramental wine, but two, the railroad used to go right in front of this building, and so logistically speaking, it made a lot of sense. And so the winery has been expanded significantly since then, but this is still, we're right in the heart, right in the core of the original winery, right here.
Yeah, you mentioned that last night about Tom Rinaldi complaining about the ever-famous, great Tom Rinaldi.
Yes. Yeah. My mentor in the business. So, Tom, of course, was the founding winemaker of Duckhorn, and then hired me in 2009 at Hewitt, which I still make today. And the story I was telling you last night was actually a time when he was he's a big cyclist, right? And he was riding his bicycle north on Highway 29 and took a huge stumble on the train tracks that were right here, and came and pounded on the door and asked them to remove the train tracks, right? Because it's not being used anymore. And the response from the general manager at the time, and they're now good friends, was, well, Tom, that's a great idea, but who's going to pay for that?
Right.
And now, of course, the train tracks have been removed, but they lasted for many, many, many decades, and it was very easy for de la Tour to roll barrels right out of the cellar and onto the rail cars, which went down to San Francisco for bottling and distribution. There have been stories of sightings. I personally have not experienced anything paranormal, but there have been a lot of incidents. Well, I'll tell you one thing: it is a bit creepy to be here by yourself at night.
Yeah,
you think about the history that's gone through this place, and there have been a number of incidents with lab personnel in the past, and cellar employees and people like this that have claimed to have seen some paranormal activity. So there definitely is a let's call it a special energy about this building, but I have not personally ever witnessed a ghost. Every day.
Yeah.
And I consider myself to be so very lucky to be the steward, essentially, of this place that has been, so significant in terms of its importance to the history of the Napa Valley, right? I mean, this is quintessential Napa Valley.
Yes, it is.
You've had some legendary winemakers who have set foot on this property and have come through here, and I talk about this with my team every day. You had mentioned, the fact that if we go back to the 1800s, which we talked about this particular building, there's actually a room upstairs with chalk marks on the ceiling that go back before the turn of the century.
Wow.
Which is crazy. So it used to be a barrel cellar upstairs. And back then, there were pyramid stacked barrels, and the guys would be sitting on top of the barrels, filling them or racking out of them or whatever it was. And they would actually document the date and the time on the ceiling with a piece of chalk when they would finish it.
Sure.
They're still up there. Wow. That is the one room that has been preserved. We've got them going back to literally the turn of the century. It's absolutely incredible that it hasn't been sprayed off since then. So you can just feel that history when you walk through this building. And then, of course, you have figures like André Teleschef, for example, who really revolutionized the way that wines were made here in the valley. And this was his home. Yeah. It's a big responsibility. I mean, so much change. And you think about, at the time that George de la Tour purchased his original property in 1900, there were more plum trees and walnuts in the Napa Valley than there were grapevines, which is something that I always find so fascinating. I mean, he really got his start. He's from Bordeaux, originally moved to the United States in the early 1880s, landed in San Francisco, and he had a business called California Tartar Works. And what he was doing was he was traveling from his home in San Francisco up to primarily Sonoma, but also the Napa Valley, and he would get to know the local vintners, and he would scrape off their tartrate crystals from inside of their tanks, which was just being a waste. It was a wasted product before. Well, that's cream of tartar, right? Yeah. So he saw this as an opportunity. Well, what if I go and I talk to these guys that are making wine, and I say, hey, I'm going to enter your tanks and I'm going to clean them for you. You just have to let me keep the tartrates. And he did that, purified them, bagged them into 100-pound bags, and he sold them, which is heavily used in baking, right? And this is how he built, this business that he was able to sell in 1900 and purchase property. My point in that is that during that time, he had this affinity towards the Napa Valley, and I think that was for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, the terroir. he was able to accurately predict that no, this is an extremely special place, and one day this is going to show up on the world map of winemaking. Secondly, logistically speaking, Napa Valley opens up to the San Francisco Bay in the south. So he was thinking logistically that, hey, I bottle my wines, I roll barrels out on the rail car, as we talked about before, or whatever, and it's very easy to get them down to the bay, load them onto ships, and ship them out. So he was always forward thinking. But at that time, there were very few grapevines that were actually planted here. And to see where it's come today now is just absolutely incredible. So I was born and raised in Sonoma County.
Oh, no kidding.
Which, of course, you surprise that I'm in the wine business, right? Although it's quite interesting because I do not have any direct family members who are in the wine business. Ironically, my father spent the majority of his career in the beer business, which made me a really popular guy in university, first of all, because I could supply a lot of beer to all my buddies. And ironically, we do say this as winemakers, that it takes a lot of good beer to make a great wine. Don't ever trust a winemaker who does not enjoy a frosty beer. At the end of the day, after tasting a bunch of wine, you want something that's going to neutralize your palate. It's crisp, it's cold, it's fresh. Amazing. Okay. Now, that being said, my family are still to this day very much wine drinkers. And so, it was a part of my culture growing up. Growing up in Sonoma, you kind of take it for granted, right? You've got grapevines everywhere. I'm just used to this. But we would always have wine at the dinner table. My parents are collectors. They were pretty cool when I was a kid in the way that they would let me, okay, smell that, honey. What do you smell there? Maybe have a little taste. Okay, that's enough. Pull it away from me. But I would talk about it from a very young age, and it was something that always intrigued me. I love to cook. I have always loved to cook since I was a kid. And wine is something that was always really special to me because it's present at the dinner table. It's typically surrounded around, I'm experiencing it with loved ones, and there's great storytelling that goes along with it. And the food and wine culture was just very much a part of how I grew up. Now, interestingly, I did not consider it as a professional option, actually, until I was already a student at UC Davis. And without going too deep into this story, my original plan was to go to the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. I know, complete diversion, okay? Now, the reason for that is I grew up extremely close to my maternal grandfather, who made it to 95. He just passed away in 2020, actually, an amazing life. But he was a World War II veteran, started in the Army Air Corps, and then what became later on the United States Air Force, and he flew B-52 bombers during the Cold War. And, he was my mentor in life, let's say. I grew up very close to my father and my grandfather, and, we had a really tight-knit family. Have a very tight-knit family, but he was my hero, and I grew up going to air shows. He taught me to play golf when I was a young teenager. He also loved wine. I wanted to follow in his footsteps, and so I had gone through the whole process. I had applied to the academy, done everything, gotten into it, all this amazing stuff, and for whatever reason, when I was a senior in high school, I got somewhat cold feet, and the reason for that was, it's going to be a 10-year commitment minimum if I do this. And I'm probably not going to have the same college experience that I would if I went somewhere else and blah, 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 blah. So UC Davis, I had applied to as a backup school. However, I joined the ROTC program at UC Davis. So I was still doing the Air Force thing, but I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go here. It's going to be a little softer. I'll have a little bit more options later on. When I was a freshman during my undergrad at Davis, I took an intro to winemaking class because turns out UC Davis has a phenomenal winemaking program. And I thought, well, I love wine. Let me take this class. I get to taste wine in class. I get to learn about the history. Are you kidding me? It's a no-brainer. I'm going to do that. Yeah. So I took this course, and this was the first time that a light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, wow, I've never actually thought of wine in this manner, in terms of I could actually build a career out of this. And so that following summer, I got a job at a local winery called Winemaker Vineyards. Out in Russian River Valley. And this was through a connection that my mother had. She had a friend who was owned a catering business, became good friends with the guy who was the winemaker at the time, the great Terry Adams, who took me under his wing. And I worked that vintage. My job, probably still the coolest job I've ever had in my life, was a grape sampler. So this is funny. So the only part that sucked about this was I had to show up at 5:30 in the morning. And you're 19 years old, that's not awesome. No. Anyway, I would show up and I would meet with the vineyard manager, and he would show me a map. This was before Google Maps and all that stuff. And he'd say, all right, here's your blocks. I want you to sample. I want you to be back by 10 a.m., not 10:01. 10 o'clock, and you need to have samples of all these blocks. And so here's the keys to the truck. You've got an ATV in the back. I would drive around to different vineyards. I would ride around on an ATV, and I would pick berry samples that represented the particular block, bring them back to the laboratory, have them all labeled. We'd go in, we'd smash the grapes up, pour the juice into a beaker, and then run chemical analysis on it, right? So you're looking at basically sugar content, pH, titratable acidity, blah, 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 blah. We would put this in a spreadsheet, which would then get submitted to the winemakers. And I got invited to then go into the room with the winemakers, taste 100 juice samples. It all tasted the same to me at the time. But I would listen to them talk about when they wanted to harvest each block. And this was intriguing to me because I got to see the behind the scenes. Then I would go out into the cellar, and this is where I was driving a forklift around. I was pumping wine from barrel to barrel. I was operating a 20-ton bladder press. It was just absolute heaven for me. And I thought to myself, wow, I don't really want to do anything else with my life. So I went back to Davis that following year, and I converted all of my my attention towards taking the prerequisite courses to get into the viticulture and enology program, which I ended up doing, and have been making wine ever since. Well, the wine itself it's a legend, right? This is something that, of course, it is our flagship at Beaulieu, but it's also, historically speaking, an incredibly important wine for the Napa Valley in general, right? It was basically the first wine to come out of this region that was accepted as kind of let's say a first growth offering out of the United States, period. First vintage was 1936. We have just released the 2019, so let's see, carry the two, that would make it the 83rd vintage, right? Consecutively. And the way that it was first created was, keep in mind, 1936, right? This is after Prohibition had ended. De La Tour had now become, quite a bit older. He wanted to pass the winemaking reins down to somebody preferably trained in Europe who could, really raise the bar in terms of quality. He saw the quality potential here, right? So he hired André Telleschef, who we spoke about earlier, out of the Pasteur Institute in Paris. André landed here in 38. One of the first things that he did upon his arrival, other than, revolutionizing the way that wines were made, things that we take for granted today, seriously, frost control in the vineyard, using known strains of yeast, for example, to complete fermentation successfully, the importance of sanitization in the winery, using smaller French oak barrels, that kind of thing, really was introduced by André in a major way. But what he started doing was he actually tasted through the 36 vintage, which hadn't been bottled yet. So back then, they were holding all of their wines for a minimum of 2 years, often 3, in these big redwood vats. Okay, and then sometimes they'd go down to a puncheon size or whatever, and then they would bottle. So he realized that 36, there's some incredible quality here. And De La Tour, his boss, had this vision of crafting a flagship for BV. And so they aligned on that. André selected his favorite lots, and he kept them aside for an additional year, brought some barrels over, went down to barrel in those, and et cetera, and blended and ultimately bottled in 1939 what would become the first vintage of Georges de la Tour Private Reserve. When they bottled it, it didn't have a name yet, okay? So they were bottled as what's called shiners, which is basically a naked bottle with no label. They didn't have a name for it. A couple of months later, in early 1940, unfortunately, our founder, Georges de la Tour, passed away. And this made it an easy decision for his widow and Telleschef to name the flagship in his honor, which is why it's called Georges de la Tour Private Reserve. The first vintage was not released until 41. Prior to its release, it was entered into a wine competition that was held on Treasure Island, just outside of San Francisco, as a part of the World's Fair. And it was tasted by an international panel of judges who had never seen anything like this in terms of quality to come out of the region. And they're looking at each other going like, oh my God, the Napa Valley is really not messing around. This is some pretty cool stuff. And from that moment on, boom, you now had a new benchmark and standard to come out of the entire region. By the time, it was released in 41, it had gained some really great press and all of that, and it became the official wine of the White House. So you're coming to visit the president from a foreign land, you're probably being served Georges de la Tour Private Reserve. And so it became really the pride and joy to come out of the whole region. And so to have the opportunity and the responsibility to get to craft that wine, and again, be a steward of a place like this is such a blessing. And we enjoy the hell out of it every day. Cool thing is, we're using essentially the same vineyards today that were being used all those years ago. So you taste back vintages, and you have this core of consistency, which is that Rutherford terroir. It's still there to this day. We have bottles going back. We do have a couple of bottles of the 1936 vintage, as well as bottles older than that, actually some of the original sacramental wines from the 1910s. The reason that we have all of these wines is because Teleszchev actually had a secret library at the winery that nobody knew about until 2013. And the reason that he started this was when the daughter took over. Her motto was to really, this was in 1952, would have been, she wasn't really holding back library wines. They were basically selling through everything. And Andre said, well, we need to keep some of this library back for future use and reference and blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to build a cellar that nobody knows about. And so literally, it's still there to this day. You go up to the old laboratory, which is decommissioned. You go into the old coat closet where the lab coats were hung. There's some stairs that are probably not to code today with it's not used anymore. Trap door up top, there's a padlock on it. Andre and the facilities manager had the key to this thing. And if you were to open it, you would be in the attic, right? There's insulation, there's, what the hell, why would you go up there? The boiler's up there. You go to the back of that, there's a carve out in the wall. You open the door, that's the tower, or the Teleszchev library. It had an air conditioner, don't worry. And this is why all of these wines have been preserved for this long. So we have an incredibly unique and fruitful, let's say, winemaking library, which is awesome from a historical perspective. It is www.bvwines.com.